Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura. Today we're diving into what some researchers are calling a genuine paradigm shift for computer vision.
That's right, Chris. And I have to say, I have not been this excited about a vision paper in a very long time, because what Google DeepMind just published with Vision Banana is the kind of result that quietly reorganizes a whole field overnight.
Okay, let's set the table for everyone listening, because the headline that's been circulating sounds almost too clean. One model that beats 5 specialized models across vision tasks, and apparently it does this just by being instruction tuned.
Exactly right. And the model at the center of this is called Vision Banana, which is a wonderfully silly name for a paper that may end up being one of the most consequential vision releases of the last several years.
Before we get into the technical details, give us the lineage here, because the base model is something called Nano Banana Pro, which I think a lot of our listeners will have heard of in a totally different context already.
Nano Banana Pro is Google's high-quality image generator, the one people have been using to make those striking photorealistic outputs. And the team essentially took that exact same generator and instruction tuned it on a small slice of vision task data.
That phrase instruction tuned is doing a lot of work though. So let me push you on what that actually looks like in practice for a vision model, rather than for a language model where most of us have heard the term first.
Great question, because in a language model, you give it instructions and it produces text. But in Vision Banana, you give it a prompt like, show the segmentation map of this image, and the model literally generates an image of the segmentation.
So the model is doing perception by generating a picture of the answer, which honestly sounds backwards from how computer vision has worked for the past decade, where you had specialized heads for each downstream task you cared about.
That is the whole punchline, Chris, and it is the part that makes seasoned vision researchers do a double take. Because we have spent 10 years building dedicated architectures for segmentation, for depth, for surface normals, and for object detection.
And these are not toy benchmarks they are competing against, so let's actually walk through the numbers. Because I think the gap between expectation and result is where the story really sells itself to skeptics in the broader field.
On Cityscapes, which is the gold standard urban driving segmentation benchmark, Vision Banana hits 0.699 mean intersection over union, which beats SAM3 at 0.652 and absolutely demolishes XDecoder at 0.520.
For listeners who do not live and breathe these acronyms, SAM3 is Meta's flagship segmentation foundation model, the one that everyone has been comparing themselves against for the past year as the universal segmenter of choice in the industry.
And it is being beaten by a generative model that was not even built primarily for segmentation, which should make every team that has been training segmentation specialists for the last 12 months look up from their workstations and start asking questions.
The depth estimation result honestly might be even more surprising to me than the segmentation one, because depth has historically been a really tough domain, where small architectural choices make a huge difference in real-world generalization performance.
Vision Banana scores a delta 1 of 0.929 on metric depth benchmarks, beating depth anything, version 3 at 0.918, and here's the part that absolutely floored me when I read the paper carefully.
I am bracing myself, so go ahead and tell us the catch. Because there usually is one when a generalist beats a specialist on a benchmark that the specialist team has been optimizing for years on end.
Vision Banana achieves that depth result using 0 real-world training data and absolutely no camera parameters, which is the kind of constraint that should make this result essentially impossible under the conventional wisdom of the computer vision field today.
Hold on. Let me make sure I am understanding this correctly, because it sounds almost unbelievable. Are you saying it learned to do metric depth without ever seeing a real depth measurement during training of the underlying model?
That is exactly what the paper claims, and it learned this entirely from synthetic data that was generated as part of the original image generation pre-training and a small amount of synthetic vision task data added during instruction tuning later.
That is a wild result, and it strongly suggests that the image generation pre-training itself is teaching the model something deep about three-dimensional structure that we did not realize image generators were learning in the first place at all.
Which is actually the central argument of the paper, and the title gives it away pretty bluntly. The researchers titled their work, Image Generators Are Generalist Vision Learners, and they really do mean every single word of that title.
Speaking of researchers, this is a good moment to flag who actually wrote this paper, because the author list reads like a Vision Research Hall of Fame, and I do not think that is a coincidence here at all.
The paper has both Kaiming and Saining on it, And if those names do not mean anything to you, Kaiming is the person behind ResNet, which is arguably the single most important architecture of modern deep learning history.
And Saining has been involved in a string of foundational vision papers over the past decade. So when these two researchers tell you that vision is undergoing a paradigm shift, it is worth at least taking the claim seriously and engaging.
This is not some random lab pushing benchmark numbers to get a press cycle. This is the people who built the foundations of modern computer vision, telling you that the foundations themselves might genuinely be due for a fundamental rebuild.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a minute, though, because benchmarks are one thing and real-world deployment is a completely different beast, especially in safety-critical applications like autonomous driving or medical imaging, where lives are on the line.
That is a totally fair pushback, and you are right that beating cityscapes by 5 points does not automatically mean you can replace a production segmentation pipeline that has been hardened over years of edge cases and unusual failure modes.
There's also the inference cost question, because a large generative model that has to actually paint the segmentation mask is going to be way more expensive at inference than a specialized model with a lightweight task head on top.
Absolutely, and Vision Banana is not going to ship inside a self-driving car next quarter. But the deeper signal here is about how teams should be thinking about their vision stack going forward over the next 2 to 3 years.
Which raises a really practical question for the dozens of computer vision startups out there right now, whose entire business is selling a specialized model for a narrow vision task to enterprise customers in retail, logistics, or manufacturing today.
I think those startups should be reading this paper extremely carefully. Because if your moat is that you have a really well-tuned segmentation model for warehouse robotics or for retail analytics, that moat just got significantly shallower overnight.
It is the same dynamic we saw in language a few years ago when GPT-class models started eating into vertical NLP startups whose entire offering was a specialized classifier or a specialized extractor for one narrow industry vertical.
Exactly that pattern, and the timing here matters because we are watching the same compression of specialist value happen in vision, just a few years behind language, and it is going to reshape the computer vision tooling market quickly indeed.
Let's talk about what this means for the actual end applications, though, because robotics and augmented reality and autonomous systems all desperately need better visual understanding. And the bottleneck has often been the cost of integrating multiple specialist models together.
For robotics, this is potentially huge. Because a humanoid robot in a warehouse needs segmentation, depth, surface normals, object recognition, and grasp prediction all at once, and historically that has meant 5 separate models running in parallel on different hardware.
And those 5 models all have different latency profiles and different failure modes and different update cycles, which is an integration nightmare for any team trying to ship a real product into a real environment with real customers depending on it.
One foundation vision model that handles all of those tasks with consistent behavior across them is genuinely better engineering. Even if any single task could in theory be done a little better by a specialist somewhere in the leaderboard.
There's also a really interesting angle here for medical imaging, where you often want depth, segmentation, and abnormality localization on the same scan. And getting consistent reasoning across those tasks has always been notoriously tricky to get right.
And medical imaging has the additional property that real labeled training data is genuinely scarce. So a model that can do well on synthetic data and small instruction tuning sets is exactly what that field has been quietly asking for.
Let's zoom out and talk about what this signals for Google DeepMind as a research organization, because this is the kind of paper that does not happen by accident inside a corporate lab without strong leadership investment behind it.
It tells you that DeepMind is very much still investing in foundational research and not just shipping product features. And they are willing to publish work that essentially undermines a lot of their own existing vision tooling across the company.
That is a really important point because Google has plenty of specialized vision products inside cloud and inside photos and inside YouTube. And Vision Banana is in some sense a long-term threat to all of those internal product teams.
But the willingness to publish it openly suggests that DeepMind sees the long arc of this being more valuable than any short-term internal disruption. And that is a healthy sign for an AI research lab to demonstrate publicly today.
Compare that to some other labs we could name, where we have seen a real pullback on publishing in recent years. And it does feel like Google DeepMind is staking out a position as the lab that still acts like a lab.
I think that is right, and from an ecosystem perspective, the more research that gets published openly and reproduced by other teams, the faster the whole field moves forward, regardless of which company shipped what specific product first in market.
Let's wrap with what to watch for over the next 3 to 6 months, because I suspect this paper is going to spawn a lot of follow-up work very quickly inside other major research labs around the world as well.
First thing I'm watching is whether Meta and OpenAI publish their own image generator-based generalist vision models. Because if this approach really does work, every major lab will want their own version on the leaderboard within months.
Second thing on my list is whether the open source community can replicate this, because the recipe sounds simple in principle, but reproducing it requires access to a strong base image generator that not everyone in the open community has.
Third thing, and this might be the most underrated angle, is what happens when robotics companies start integrating models like this into their perception stacks, because the gains there could be very visible and very fast for end users.
And finally, I want to see whether anyone tries to push this approach into video understanding, because if image generation is the right pre-training for spatial reasoning, then video generation might be the right pre-training for temporal reasoning as well.
That would be the natural next paper. And honestly, I would not be surprised if there is already a Vision Banana sequel in the works inside DeepMind right now that extends these results to video and to longer horizon temporal reasoning.
Before we close out, anything you want our listeners to take away as the single biggest lesson from this whole story, given that most of them are not vision researchers themselves, but are watching the broader AI field unfold around them?
I would say the biggest takeaway is that the unification of AI subfields under a single generative paradigm is not slowing down, it is accelerating. And vision was the last major holdout that had not yet been folded into that paradigm.
That is a great way to frame it, because once you start seeing every modality through that single generative lens, a lot of strategic choices about which models to invest in and which startups to back start looking very different indeed. That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening to today's deep dive on the Vision Banana paper, and we'll see you next time with another fresh look at the AI ecosystem from every angle.